Thank you for being here with us tonight to celebrate and present the new book by Caterina Romeo, Interrupted Narratives and Intersectional Representations in Italian Postcolonial Literature. I love the idea that it's an Italian scholar who studied in the United States, returned to Italy, writes a book in English about Italian literature, and we bring her here. That is exactly what we are here for. So thank you for doing this here at the Casa. And this evening, since the organizer of the evening was Edvige Giunta, I'm going to leave to her the pleasure and the honor to introduce Caterina and her co-discussant. And I just want to have the pleasure of telling you something about Edvige Giunta. Edvige Giunta is one of the founding mothers of Italian-American studies. If Italian-American studies is what it is today, that is a non-parochial, non-sectarian, open-minded, diverse field, it's also because of Edvige Giunta. Edie is a professor of English at New Jersey City University, but I would say that her most popular course is on memoir writing. It's a course that attracts students from all backgrounds. Many of them are first-generation immigrant students. And that is another proof that Italian-American studies is not only for Italian-Americans, and what you learn in it can be used and can be discussed and be part of the curriculum of any ethnicity, of any minority. What struck me about Edie from the first moment I met her, and she and her group at that time, that was the Italian-American Collective, then the Malia Collective, was one of the first groups with which I worked as director of the Casa. And the events we organized with them are still in my memory and contributed to make me what I am in terms of director of this place, and to open my mind to themes and people that otherwise would have not been under my radar. And for this I would be very grateful. And Edie personifies also the idea of the public intellectual. And the public intellectual, let me tell you one thing, was not Alberto Moravia. And there is a little story I need to tell you. Journalists would call Italo Calvino, asking him an opinion just about everything that was happening, including the last elections and the issue about that party that was split into two. And Calvino very politely would answer, you know, I'm a writer. I don't follow so closely daily political events to have something intelligent to say about this. But I have a good friend who knows basically everything, and I'm sure he'd be glad to give you a quote. And he gave them the number of Alberto Moravia that they had already anyway. And Moravia never failed to give a quote about just anything. That is not what I mean by public intellectual. Public intellectual is somebody like Edie that makes a step back to promote the work of other writers, of other scholars, to create a community of scholars that in turn becomes the producer of new scholars, intellectuals, people who read. That's enough. We don't need to put any other title. And she has done fantastic work republishing the works of very important Italian-American women writers with the feminist press. She co-wrote books with authors. She regularly presents and promotes the work of other authors. That's what I mean by public intellectual. An intellectual that is not closed, locked in her office, but who is open to the community, so she knows how to speak with everybody and how to help colleagues, older and younger, to bring in the world what they do. So this is Edvige Giunta, and I leave to her the presentation of her colleagues. Grazie.
Well, I certainly didn't expect that. My role here is really to welcome and celebrate this spectacular work and our friend Caterina Romeo. It's always wonderful for me to be back at Casa Italiana. Stefano mentioned our collaboration and his appreciation, but my personal appreciation, and the appreciation of the Italian-American women writers, artists, and scholars who have benefited from the generous hospitality of the years given us. I don't even know if you know what a profound impact, because Italian-American studies really started, was a field, but women really were literally on the margins on this field, and we really felt kind of homeless, and here we felt at home. I love that this place is called Casa. So thank you, Stefano, and thank you all the incredible staff of Casa Italiana, especially Julian, for always working so wonderfully, so efficiently, so professionally. So I've written some remarks. Caterina is very, very dear to me, and sometimes I've written on so many people that I know personally. And sometimes what I have to do is when I write about people I know, I can't talk to them. Actually, I told Katia, I can't talk. Okay? I really need to just walk away and really reflect on who this person is. And to separate the personal from the professional, it's not always necessary, but it must be done also in a moment of reflection and quiet. So as I prepare to welcome Caterina Romeo today, I pulled out from my Italian-American bookshelf, which is where I keep all her books, everything that had her name, a good solid pile that included a thick volume with a green paper cover, a dissertation dated anno accademico 1999-2000. As I flipped through the pages and lingered on the inscription, I reflected on Caterina's literary journey and thought of the importance of events like this, here today, of necessary cultural conversations of Italy and the United States, of back and forth, of taking and bringing across. Literary journeys can be solitary affairs, especially when we choose paths where the question of legitimacy and authority are at stake. When during our journey of research and writing we encounter kindred spirits, we know we have received the gift. Sometimes we are so fortunate that the professional scholarly relationships deepen to include our personal lives. The scholarly work becomes part of that. Books and publication become the markers of another history, the history of a friendship fed by a shared love for literature. I first met Caterina at a conference of the Italian-American Studies Association. It was the 1990s. She was an Italian doctoral student venturing into a field that in Italy had received little, if any, recognition. And frankly, Italian-American studies was far from being a recognized academic field in the United States as well. And here, I want to say again, thank you, Stefano, and thank you, Casa Italiana, for making Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò the first truly hospitable space for Italian-American women writers. Caterina wanted to write about Italian-American women and memoir. Un giardineggio, as we would say in Sicilian, my sweet little garden, what I care about, what I cherished. And so we talked and talked and continued to talk for years, for over 2 decades. We haven't stopped talking. Undeterred by the professional risks of pursuing a relatively new field without the security of an academic job, Caterina chose to write a doctoral dissertation on Italian-American women and memoir. I had the privilege of serving on her dissertation committee and working closely with Caterina in those early stages of her scholarly journey. Very soon, we became collaborators. Together, we worked on many projects, such as special issues of the Italian journals Tutte Storie and Leggendaria, devoted to Italian-American women. In 2005, she published her first book, Narrative tra due sponde, Memoir di Italiane d'America. Caterina does not just write essays and books about writers and literary issues. She has embraced literary scholarship with the fervor of an activist. I remember the feeling all those years ago of having found an ally and one who was steeped in contemporary Italian culture and language in a way I no longer was, not only because I had never been an Italianist, not even in Italy, but because I'd been writing in English after moving to the United States in 1984. Caterina generously translated my own work into Italian. She took me back home through language. And she has done that by translating the writing of many Italian-American women writers for literary journals, and by taking on the monumental task of finding a publisher for and translating herself such classics as Luis de Salvo's Vertigo and Tim Ragusa's The Skin Between Us. When the De Salvo family and I had to choose a translator for an excerpt of an unfinished manuscript of Luis, Caterina was the obvious choice. Let me read from a short essay that accompanied a translation of De Salvo's Sister 5, published in 2022. Quote, "What I always tell my students on the rare occasion when I teach translation is, remember that this is not your text. And yet, is it not? What does the process of lending your voice to another writer entail? How much of your process, of your presence as a translator can be tolerated in a text? How much of your presence is ethically acceptable in a text? At the same time, if all writers are embodied subjects who have specific positionality in a social, historical, and geopolitical context, so are translators. Translating means transferring, as the two terms have the same Latin etymology and the same meaning, to take across. This is, we could say, a translator task, taking the reader across languages and cultural systems while being at the same time present in and absent from the text, end quote. And here, Caterina is delving, I believe, in the role of the literary scholar as a kind of translator, who opens doors for taking readers across and for bringing writers across. After completing her PhD at Rutgers University in 2006, Caterina returned to Italy and became a faculty member at the University La Sapienza di Roma, where she's currently an associate professor and teaches literary theory, migration studies, postcolonial studies, and gender studies. Her work has moved in a different direction, yet one that maintains contiguity and continuity with her early work in Italian-American studies. Immersing herself in Italian postcolonial literature, Caterina has co-edited 3 volumes, the book Postcolonial Italy, a special issue of the Postcolonial Studies journal titled Postcolonial Europe, yes, and the special issue of the Journal of Postcolonial Writing titled Intersectional Italy. I have a 42 font, so. Her essays on the memoir and autobiography, Italian postcolonial literature, intersectionality, representations of Italian blackness, and Italian-American literature and culture have been published in national and international journals and edited volumes. In 2018, she published a foundational book in the field of Italian postcolonial literature, Riscrivere la nazione, la letteratura italiana postcoloniale. This year, yet another book, Tra follia e realismo magico, la produzione narrativa di Domenico Dara. She's now at work on a book on Italy's recent emigrations. Today, Caterina will discuss with us the recent US publication of her book, Interrupted Narratives and Intersectional Representations in Italian Postcolonial Literature, an illuminating study of Italian postcolonial writing, essential readings for readers who are both familiar and unfamiliar with Italian postcolonial literature. And here I want to say that one of the things I've enjoyed the most, and there is no selfless act here, no desire for self-erasure, but sharing the stage, being in conversation with other scholars is one of the most rewarding experiences for a scholar. So I'm really delighted and grateful that my friend and colleague, Gabriella Romani, is here with us and will be part of this conversation. And I know that her questions for Caterina will certainly open different perspectives on how we look at this important field of study. And now, here, in this very auditorium, where in the year 2000, the first symposium on Italian and Italian women writers took place, with the responsibility of taking and bringing writers and readers across cultural borders and divides is valued and cherished. It is my great pleasure to welcome Caterina Romeo.
Wow, that was quite an introduction. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I would like to start by, of course, thanking Stefano Albertini for this wonderful invitation and Casa Italiana. I would like to thank Eddie for this wonderful, wonderful introduction and for discussing this book with me today together with Gabriella Romani, and I also want to thank Gabriella for making herself available for this discussion. I'm happy to see so many friends and colleagues in the audience. I'm very thankful that you took the time to come and discuss the book with me. I would like to start by reading a couple of pages from the introduction to the book. The introduction, so this book, this Interrupted Narratives and Intersectional Representations in Italian Postcolonial Literature, is an expanded edition of my Italian Riscrivere la Nazione. But as you can imagine, the whole operation of translating and updating the volume was quite an extensive operation, because there were parts of this book that were written anew for this edition, parts that were re-elaborated, and of course it was necessary to update the whole volume because so many things happened in the past 4 years that it was necessary to acknowledge all that. I will start, so I will read a couple of pages from the introductory chapter, which is called Decolonizing Italian Literature, which was written specifically for this edition, because of course a book has a different meaning and a different role in different geopolitical and cultural contexts. So I had to reposition this book in the culture for an American audience, and so I will read from the introduction. Italian postcolonial literature is one of the most historically significant, culturally incisive, and artistically revitalizing literary and cultural phenomena that have developed in Italy in recent decades. It has consistently provided a symbolic representation of the numerous social changes that have taken place in Italy since the late 1980s as a result of transnational migrations, encouraging society to question the very concept of a monolithic and immutable Italian identity, to rethink itself and to conceive of migrants and Italians of foreign origins in ways that go beyond rejection and victimization. Since the early 1990s, Italian postcolonial literature has contributed to the reconfiguration of the numerous narratives, including cultural canons, disciplinary fields, documents, monuments, and memories, that in different ways, but through common trajectories, have constructed and stabilized the notion of an Italian national identity and culture articulated within and only within national boundaries and expressed almost only in the Italian national language. Such reconfiguration systematically challenges the notion of an imagined national homogeneity and promotes a transnational and post-national approach. The present volume is a tribute to the social importance, cultural relevance, and literary significance of Italian postcolonial literature. The expression Italian postcolonial literature, over 30 years after its inception, which conventionally dates back to 1990, is far from widely accepted The term postcolonial until a few years ago was, quote, an almost clandestine word in the context of Italian studies in Italy, end of quote. This was quoted from De Robertis 2014, a field that still struggles to acknowledge the cultural significance of this literary production. The marginality to which Italian postcolonial literature is confined in Italy translates into a number of academic practices that tend to constantly delegitimize not only this body of literature, but also the critical and theoretical work associated with it, as articulated by scholars in the field. Even if in the past decade, postcolonial literature has become increasingly more visible in the Italian culturescape, at cultural events and in publishing industry, schools and university programs, academic essays and newspapers and magazines, the term postcolonial is seldom used and is often replaced by expressions such as migration literature, but also migrant, post-migrant, multicultural, intercultural, Italophone, expatriate, and translingual literature, among others. Such terminology, however, obliterates the connection with the Italian and European colonial history and the legacy of such history in contemporary Italy. And it fails to highlight, investigate, and question the power relations European colonial systems have put in place, or the ways in which such relations are reactivated in contemporary times, especially through mechanisms of border control, production of clandestinity and illegality, processes of othering and racialization, and restrictions on citizenship. Determining how to define and categorize literature written in Italy by migrant writers and their descendants, therefore, acquires a strong social and political valence because it means reflecting not only on the criteria of inclusion and exclusion operated by the Italian literary and cultural canons, but also on who can be considered Italian and European and what the social and cultural role of these subjects is and can be. It means interrogating what constitutes Italianità and to what norm, be it somatic, chromatic, cultural, or other, it is necessary to conform in order to be included in this privileged category. Postcolonial writers in contemporary Italy and in other European countries contribute to bringing colonial archives to light and rewriting colonial history, to denouncing contemporary racism as a legacy of colonialism, and revealing the processes of racialization that are structural in the formation of an Italian national identity, to highlighting the intersection of racism and sexism, to questioning the social and cultural privileges of normative Italians, and rearticulating the dynamics of power, and to underlining the strong resistance to considering the intersection between Blackness and Italianness as viable in a society that has historically constructed itself as white and Catholic. The postcolonial perspective deployed in this volume examines the temporal as well as the spatial continuity that connects Italy's many diasporas in different historical periods and geographical areas, demonstrating the ways in which transnational and intranational mobilities have caused Italians to occupy positions of hegemony as well as subalternity in the past and in the present. Considering different migrations as lying on a continuum rather than being independent from one another, quote, aims to overcome the methodological nationalism embedded in the study of the experiences of Italian mobility when these are considered as separate phenomena, end of quote. This also allows the contemporaneity of Italy to be connected with that of other European countries that took part in colonization and or shared a widespread colonial culture, a conspicuous legacy of which is still present in the mechanism of social and cultural exclusion and differential inclusion of migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and their descendants. The common post-colonial condition of contemporary Italy and of other communities, and of other European countries, creates transnational trajectories among diasporic communities affected by the legacy of colonialism. This occurs in ways similar to those noted by Paul Gilroy among different Black communities and cultures around the world that have, from the common experience of the African diaspora, developed shared characteristics and aesthetics in different geopolitical contexts. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I think it works now. Well, first of all, let me just say I am not a scholar of postcolonial studies, but maybe that's why I've been invited to be part of this conversation, to to going back to what was said before about Eddie, who invited me, and trying to make it as large as possible of a discussion. I have many questions, so we're going to try to have somewhat a conversation between the three of us, but then we'll open the floor to the public for questions, if you have, as I'm sure you will. So first of all, it's my pleasure. It's really my pleasure to be here. I've known both Caterina and Eddie for a very long time, although we never really see each other. But so this is a great opportunity also to see each other. I'm very pleased that this book has been translated into English. I think that anyone who is interested in postcolonial studies in Italy really is going to find all the necessary information in there. Really is going to find all they need and want to know in this book. It's extremely comprehensive. There is not only a listing of all the authors, all the books, all the films and TV series that have been have emerged over the years, starting in the 1990s. But there is also very comprehensive analysis of these works that recur in different chapters, and I like that too. It's not just chronological, but it's thematic as well. So one methodological question I'd like to start. And that is, postcolonial studies, of course, it's very central to your reading. It's even on the title. But could you explain a little bit the way that you use both postcolonial studies and race studies within your analysis, and also from the perspective of an Italian scholar, analyzes Italian text?
Sure. Thank you for your introduction, also, Gabriella, and for this question. This is a very complex question, as you know. The fourth chapter in this book is devoted to race and to racial constructions and racial representations in Italian culture, especially as connected to Italian postcolonial literature. Is it? Oh, yeah, it's working. I'm sorry. So I was saying that the fourth chapter is devoted to race and racial constructions in Italy and racial representations. And the whole debate on race studies and postcolonial studies, of course, intersect. I think that when we discuss racial formations, it's always important to understand in what kind of cultural and historical context these racial formations occur. And as I hope becomes clear in the chapter, when we speak about contemporary processes of racialization in Italy, we need to connect that to the colonial history of Italy, not only to the colonial history of Italy, which is, of course, very important because the encounter with the other and the racialized other, but it's also important to understand how this intersects other racial formations that, for example, include the Italian emigration, for example, to the United States. So when migrations occur, subjects are repositioned also from a racial point of view, from a racial perspective. And so we need to understand what I specifically speak about in the chapter about race here is race as a post-colonial phenomenon. So as connected to colonial history and how this is one of the mechanisms that is reproduced in contemporary societies. For example, in Italian contemporary society as a legacy from the colonial culture, from the colonial representations, from colonial imaginaries. But it's also very important to understand that the whole process of racialization of Italians during Italian migrations, during Italian emigrations, has also been relevant for racial constructions in Italy.
Actually, I was thinking of one of the books you translated is The Skin Between Us.
Yes.
And you started your work as a scholar of Italian-American women writers, and Kim Ragusa was one of the authors that you wrote about, and Luis de Salvo and translated.
Che è successo? Yeah, it is. Mine is, yes.
Repeat. So, Caterina, you translated, you wrote about and translated Kim Ragusa's The Skin Between Us, a memoir by a writer who writes about African American and Italian American families. You've also translated and written about Luis de Salvo's writes also about race in the brilliant essay Color White, Complexion Dark. So these issues, these were issues that you've been exploring. I was wondering I'm really curious about the whole process of how you moved from your focus on Italian-American women writers and their memory work, then to a different group of writers, still the issues of migration, obviously very different contexts, and other very important but also different issues of memory.
Well, I think what Stefano was saying at the very beginning is important. When I came here the first time, I was enrolled in the Italian PhD when you became my mentor and my dissertation director, and I came here to study Italian-American women. And which is a work that I brought back to Italy then, because as you were saying, there was very little attention for Italian-American literature in general and for the literature of Italian-American women, which was developing at the time when I first came here. It was the end of the 90s, as you said. It was 1997 when I started. And then when I started the American PhD at Rutgers, and I started studying postcolonial theory and postcolonial literature, although not Italian postcolonial literature, because there was very little about Italian postcoloniality at the time. It was the beginning of the year 2000, the first decade of the third millennium. Then I wanted to well, first of all, putting the two fields in conversation is something that came later. What I wanted to do is more continue to study issues on migration, but reversing the perspective. It was not anymore the perspective of people who had left Italy, but what it meant for people who were coming to Italy to actually arrive in the country, and if and how the experience of emigration had some role in the way Italians of Italian origins interacted with people. And of course, when we speak about migration, it's a different, it's always there is a lot of attention that I devoted to memory, as you said, to memoir as a genre, but to memory and to the role of memory and the construction of a cultural history through this memory, which is something that is always central when people move, because of course the act of moving and of relocating also brings a loss of public memory and the creation of a public memory also, because it's something that, of course, it's the creation of a memory that is far away from the country, but is reminiscent of that country. And I think that these are also elements that are present in the literature of migrant and post-colonial writers in Italy. Of course, there is also another aspect here, which is the memory of colonialism. We were, as we were saying when Gabriella asked about race, when we speak about coloniality and colonialism, we speak also about the legacy of colonialism more, well, in general, but in the way this memory forges imaginaries, and how the memory of colonialism is strongly present in the work of writers, as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said, that who were born after colonialism was over, but still their imaginaries are forged through that process and through that cultural memory and through that national memory.
Well, going to right after that thought, the national memory, you make a clear connection between the literature that develops and evolves starting in the 90s and the colonial experience of the 19th century. But am I understanding well that even though you don't really delve into it, that obviously something that doesn't come out of nothing, colonialism, and that the very notion of national identity, this is something that I've been thinking a lot. I'm writing a piece on the Risorgimento and making Italians. What does it mean to be an Italian in the 1950s and 1850s and 1860s? Who is the Italian that we imagine being Italian? Historians like Banti have very convincingly explained that really is imagined as a kind of a family network, like an enclosed world, based on a family legacy and based on exclusions and inclusions, notions of exclusion and inclusions. And there is, there's a book that I found very interesting, Edoardo Barsotti, At the Roots of the Italian National Identity, that he finds that even the word race is used in the 1840s already, in terms of stock, stirpe in Italian and so on. It was not stereotyping the other as much as constructing the self. But you construct yourself at the expense of others, of course. I just want to hear from you if you can say a little more about this connection from the 19th century, the colonial experience, and what we have as a contemporary literature that is expanding our understanding of the Italian national identity. But that is something that has really marked the beginning of our nation. Not only the colonial experience that came, at the end of the 19th century and then in the 1930s.
This is a very complex question. I'm not sure I can answer sufficiently, but I want to say something about what I think is very relevant also to my search of what Italianità means, as something that Cristina Lombardi Diop and I wrote in the introduction to Postcolonial Italy 10 years ago, in which we were arguing that it's important to think that the unification occurred between 1861, 1870, and that is more or less the time in which the Great Migration started. And it's also the time when colonialism started. So it's important to think that the national identity formation process is something that took place both at a national and an international and transnational level. in the sense that when I was reading, I said that Italy has constructed, and European identity has been constructed as white and Catholic. That is something, as you were saying, you always construct the self against something, and by constructing the self, you exclude or marginalize or otherize the other, actually. So that is something that is, I think, very important for the construction of an Italian national identity, because there was the Risorgimento in Italy, but at the same time, Italians have, from the end of the 19th century on, a position at the same time of a hegemonic position in the colonial process, at the same time as a subaltern position as emigrants. If we think about the little Italy's forming around the world. So I think that this is something, the transnational nature of the process of forming a national identity when we speak about Italy, is something that should be taken into consideration as a very central moment, I think, and process.
And these emigration groups were also called colonies.
Say it again?
These
yes.
immigration, communities were also called colonies.
Yeah,
I think it will be also very interesting to look how, illustrated magazines and writers in the 1870s represented traveling in some of the countries that became colonies, traveling to Africa, and how they prepare colonialism as it came later. Your turn.
Very interesting, because in the 1960s, in the 1960s, there were these, I guess would be the equivalent of the summer camp. They were called colonie. And, that was in Italy. Yes, children were sent to La Colonia. These are really fascinating issues, and of course, I know Jabba Sheg has been a guest here, and their book, The Color Line, certainly fits really well in this conversation. Katia, I wanted to ask you about the passage from the Italian book to the book that you prepared for an American audience. It's not, translation is always complicated, but you have been involved in every aspect of the preparation of the publication and the translation of this book for American audience. And I know you have expanded and updated, but could you talk about what is really at the heart of the difference between these two books, and in what way your experience as a scholar was also trained here in the United States, your familiarity with an American academic audience and readership shaped any aspects of the American version of the book?
Yes, sure. Thank you for the question. Now, first of all, as you said before, I have translated a number of Italian-American writers, including you, but I do not translate myself, so I'm not the translator of my book. Some parts were written directly in English for this expanded edition, and I want to thank Ellen McRae for translating the parts of the book that were translated from the Italian version. The structure of the book is the same, except that, as I said, I rewrote the introductory chapter, and then I added some sections, especially in the first, well, actually in all of them, in all of the chapters. And sections were added for different reasons, because there was something interesting that I had to leave out from the previous version, or simply because something very important had happened that I didn't take into, well, I couldn't take into account in the previous version, because it happened after the Italian book was published, Rischi della Nazione was published. And I'm thinking, for example, that of the fact that in chapter 2, which is a chapter where I reconstruct what happens in these 30-some years, I divide the cultural production of migrant and post-colonial writers into three different phases. Of course, generalizing some of the aspects that are relevant according to me. And then I think, which is something that I had in this book, that the Riscrivere la Nazione came out in 2018, but in 2019, something happened which I think was really relevant and is still happening, which is an incredible and very important production of Black Italian women writers who have been writing not only they have been writing specifically about what it means to be Black in Italy, and they have adopted a specifically very complex intersectional perspective. And I'm thinking, for example, of starting with the anthology Future, which is edited by Giabascego and came out in 2019. But then Esperanza Cuzzimana Ripanti at the time, now she's not using Ripanti anymore. Esperanza Cuzzimana Ripanti, who wrote E poi basta, manifesto di una donna nera italiana, Jarakan, Ladri di denti, Oisa Obasui, Corpi estranei, Nadisha Uyangoda, l'unica persona nera nella stanza, the only Black person in the room. There is also a podcast associated with it, and the second season just came out a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago. Sabrina e Fionai, adesso no, Addio a domani. Anna Maria Gainey, also known as Karima 2G, who is a beat maker and a musician and now wrote a memoir. And this is something that to me appears like a new, I don't want to use the word phenomenon, a new trend, let's say, in Italian post-colonial literature, which I find extremely relevant, not only because I think it's always very difficult to discuss race and color in Italy, and they're doing it very openly, because they're very openly adopting an intersectional perspective, so they're intersecting race and gender in a way that is seldom done in the Italian culture. And I think that this production is extremely important, and it's changing also. I hope that the way we talk about race also changes in Italy, because race remains a very difficult word to use. So, for example, this is one of the sections that I added in this volume, together with a section in the last chapter in which I examined the work of 4 writers, and I read one short story by Jadlen Mabiala Gangbo vis-à-vis the film that inspired it, La Haine, very famous Kassovitz film from the 1990s about banlieues in Paris and in France. And I think that this is something that also is very present in the production of the Black women writers whom I mentioned before, that what they are doing now, they are creating a connection with other Black feminist writers around Europe, which I think is extremely relevant in the Italian very strongly patriarchal culture.
For sure. In your book, you just said now, you also analyze, besides books and narratives, you also analyze films, podcasts, TV series. And I wonder how you think that has changed somewhat the understanding, what kind of influence? I mean, I'm thinking young people don't read anymore, read very little. They watched TV series. I mean, I'm generalizing, of course, but unfortunately, I think that if we're using the word trend, that seems to be the trend. So how much does that change the understanding of Black Italian culture? I had the chance to see Di Stefano's latest film, Autumn Beat, a couple of weeks ago in Philadelphia, was showed. It was actually quite remarkable, where all the characters are Black, like Zero, the Netflix series. And it really gives you it opens a window on the life of Italy, but seen from the perspective of a Black community. There are no white characters, if not kind of marginal in the crowd. And it tells us about Italy. So how films like that are received in Italy, I wonder? Can you tell us a little about the reception of these kind of works?
I don't know about this specific film because I haven't seen it. But
it's very similar to Zero.
Yeah, no. Zero, I think that Zero was, there was a lot of discussion about that before it came out, but then they didn't do a second season, so there was just that one. And I think it was not as well received as it was hoped. But I think it's very important to have this kind of cultural productions. I mean, we know already, that considering the aesthetics of this kind of production can be, if we analyze, if we consider this kind of production as a production that doesn't have a tradition, we also understand that maybe considering the aesthetics is not necessarily our first preoccupation. It's not my first preoccupation, but as a cultural product, I think it's extremely important precisely for what you were saying, that it constructs a different kind of imaginary. If you see all Black authors, actors on screen, and that gives you a representation of the way Italian society is changing and has changed, and that I think is not represented enough. But I'm thinking, for example, as you say, I refer to some films. Of course, I'm not an expert in film. I know Anya Healy was here a couple of days ago, like at the end of last week, and she is an expert in the field instead, or Leonardo De Franceschi, who's done a lot of work about that in Italy. But for example, what I thought was culturally extremely important was, come si chiama? Faimbuyan Bangla, for example. And that film, for example, that film was extremely successful. And actually, when I went to watch that movie with Anya Healy, in fact, it was interesting that Checco Zalone was also there watching the movie. And then when the director came, he went to meet him, and they started talking. And I think that a film like that is very important, not only because it represents, a community of which we don't know very much, which is the Bangladeshi community, Bengali community in Rome, in Torpignattara actually, but also because that is a comedy, and that changes things. It's when I watched that movie, I thought of this other collection, which is called Pecore Nere, this anthology of short stories, which I always quote as the point when something happens, which is a collection of 8 short stories where the second generation authors also, not only, but also make fun of their own community, and also make fun of the Italian community, of course, and of the Italian culture. And I think that that is a specific trait of what we generally, and not very precisely call second generations, that they are part of the Italian community, of course. At the same time, they have a different community of origin, and their parents are rooted in a different culture. And they are immersed in both, but at the same time, they can keep their distance from both. And so there is that irony that comes, which is very absent generally from the work of first generation. So I think this is something that is having a very, that is really very important, not only because, as you were saying, people read less than they used to, maybe, but also because there is a differentiation of cultural productions. You were mentioning also podcasts, and I actually just published an article together with Giulia Fabbri about podcasts that that discuss race. And Nadisha Uyangoda, who wrote this, L'unica persona nera nella stanza, the only black person in the room, she is also the author of a podcast, and I just mentioned that the second season just came out. And I think it's not only relevant that they discuss race through keywords that they explain. So they explain what, Italian postcolonial literature means, what tokenism means, and so on and so forth. But also because the title of the podcast is Sulla razza. So, mentioning race just like that is still something that is not very frequent in Italy. So it seems to me that there is an urge to discuss race as race, not as, ethnicity or, cultural difference, race.
Thank you. I think we should give our audience an opportunity to ask them questions.
Is there someone going to the microphone?
Wow. Okay.
Hi, can you talk about the general structure of the book and what went into your decisions to talk about it in that way?
Sure, yeah. Okay, after the introduction, well, what I do in the second chapter, as I said, is analyzing these 30 years and see what trends are important. Well, there is something that I do there, which is something that I learned from Eddie many years ago, which is not only from Eddie, but also from the Italian-American community that was name names. So, I try to give as many examples as I can, because I think that it's important to understand that we're not talking about a couple of authors, we're talking about a real cultural very important cultural contribution to the Italian culture. So in the second chapter, that is what I do, trying to understand what the trends are, what the themes are, how literature changes in the number of genres that are explored, for example, and to see what different characteristics are there in the first decade, in the second decade, and how it changes. Then the word intersectional is intersectional, yes, representation. So the intersectionality is a central methodology in the volume. So I explain how I want to use intersectionality by constantly intersecting gender and race, but at the same time, what seems to be a contradiction, but I think it's not. I try to explain how to me it is not. I isolate gender in one chapter and race in another chapter with this kind of, what Gayatri Spivak would define as strategic essentialism. So, by exploring gender and all the colonial imaginaries that are pervasive in Italian culture. And then I devote instead the fourth chapter. So the third chapter is on gender, and the fourth chapter is on race and processes of racialization. So it's a thematic approach, as Gabriella was observing before, in the third and the fourth chapter, and also in the last one, which is the fifth chapter, which is a chapter that is that includes only 4 authors, because I find the way they use space very relevant to understand how first of all, how space is a very important element precisely for what I was saying before. If we think about national space, if we think about the impossibility of accessing that national space, and therefore, you know, what happens in the Mediterranean, and the control of space is something that is part of the nation state. And then also because migrants and second generation and post-colonial subjects are changing the structure of the space, the way space is articulated, urban space is articulated. And that is what the chapter is about, the last one.
Question.
Joanna.
I would say I have a completely inappropriate question for you.
Okay,
Okay.
I think that's fun.
I am obsessed with the idea of the creation of self and the implicit othering of everybody else. Mm. And here the three of you said, Gabriella, I don't know about you, but you have been immigrants, right? You have experienced this exact thing we're talking about personally. So can I ask this? How do you position yourselves personally within the context of what you are talking about in a scholarly way? Any of the three of you? 'Cause I think how the hell we cling to each other in this identity, knowing that it means we're parochial in this Italian and Italian-American identity. I think we have very complicated feelings about this as writers and as scholars.
Well,
How many hours do we have?
well, I think that, I mean, from the very beginning, when I very timidly and yet encountering much criticism for doing so, I included some personal reflections in critical writing in my first book, Writing with an Accent. I have always recognized and described myself as a very privileged immigrant. I came with an F1 visa on an Alitalia flight, and with $600 required by the University of Miami in my account that my father and my mother gave me. And so there are no direct, the commonalities that I add to the experience of migration of writers I was writing about could not ignore that. But I think there are issues of kinship, of empathy, of solidarity, of intergenerational memory, and also geography, and for me specifically being Sicilian, that came into place. There are also politics. I came from a family of socialists, anti-fascists, so that shaped also my consciousness. So I don't think it's a matter of identification, but it's a matter of solidarity and affinity of ideas and shared goals. But I would not, that would not erase the differences.
Just want to add something that it is often understood that Giovanni Verga wrote about Sicily when he went away from Sicily. Being away, I think, is the first time. It's what obviously spurred a lot of the questions once you don't take for granted so many things. But also realizing that a lot of those sense of security, being Italian in Italy, perhaps you're not forced to ask yourself questions that you ask once you go outside of Italy, and you still think, oh, what does that mean, being Italian? But obviously, this is not.
That's exactly also what I think happened to me, because I started studying migration when I was not in Italy. And I don't have a background as an Italianist. I also come from English, and instead I began to study Italy while I was doing my PhD here, although, of course, a specific aspect of that. But I also remember, now that we're talking about memory and we're talking about Italian American studies, I remember when I started in Italian American studies in the late 90s, and I remember that of course, I didn't come as Eddie. I came here as a graduate student. I had money that my family had given me. I was privileged. So I didn't identify with what I was reading or what that history was saying. But I have a history. My family has a history of migration. All of my great uncles, all of them, migrated to the United States, so that is part of the family. And also my family is from southern Italy, so that is yet another level of otherness that you incorporate, and that is there. It's part of the family history. It doesn't go anywhere. Yes, I am privileged, but for example, now she was mentioning the last book that came out. This is the came out like 2 weeks before the last one, which is about something completely different from what I generally do, which is a book on this author from novelist from Calabria. And my book is dedicated to Calabria and to my family. So, it's, for me, it's definitely something that is very important. It's always there, and it's part of the history of my family, and it's something that when I study migrations, it's always, my family migrated from the north to the south, and this kind of international migration has a lot to do also with the hegemonic and subaltern position. So it's, of course, not necessarily that kind of migration, but it's a part of a combination of migratory movements that has shaped also, my culture, not just personal, but also cultural identity. I mean, it's, of course, if I keep studying migrations, in different directions, that means that must have had a very important role in my personal and professional life.
I'm just going to add this one thing. I just feel that as a community, it's something that we all have to think about individually, but also collectively, privileged migration or not. We have these complex identities that we both are passionately involved with, and I find also brings me a sense of shame in a disassociation from others. I think it's a wonderfully complicated and confusing and worthy of many discussions. So, and that was what I needed to hear from you personally. So thank you.
Thank you, Joso, for always asking deeply heartfelt, honest questions that make us think. I find that very often, I think in Americans are surprised by the fact that terms such as emigrato and razzismo in Italy were used in the relationship between the North and the South. So people from the South emigrated to the North, and the North. They still do. Okay. Yes, they still do. But I think there is a greater sense of mobility, and also I think younger generation do not carry because of education. Also, they don't carry. I think the burden of shame that certainly earlier generation experienced, and also racism. So I mean, there are all these layers. And for me, it wasn't until I really studied and wrote about Italian American women that I got myself into an archive and found a birth certificate of my great-grandmother, and where it said that described the father, so my great-great-grandfather, Villico, and his mother, my great-great-grandmother, Plebea. So these histories also get buried, and sometimes the work of doing literary criticism and research, whatever calls us, becomes a way to find our way back to stories that were completely unknown to us.
Hello. Hi. So on the same vein, I just wanted to ask another question that's personal as well about migration. And I'm wondering if, and I guess I understand that your work has been done in terms of, colonial and post-colonial Italy, and especially with Italian Americans, but have you delved into any other Italian migrations and how they connect or intersect with Italian identity? And in particular, as you know, I'm Brazilian. I was wondering, that's a huge, great, Italian migration that takes place basically at the same time as the American migration. Do you have anything?
I used to have a Brazilian roommate who always told me that he knew for a fact that the best pizza is made in São Paulo.
In São Paulo, of course.
Of course. Okay. So, no, actually, that is one migration that I don't know much about, a little bit, but not much about. But I have actually studied other migrations in addition to the migration to the United States, because I spent 4 years ago, I spent 5 months in New Zealand, and so I also studied Italian literature produced by Italian people, or connections with in community, old and new. And as Eddie, I think, was saying before when she was reading my biography, I'm also, this is something at a very initial stage, but I find it extremely interesting to study new emigrations, because there was a time when all articles started. Before being a country of immigration, Italy was a country of immigration. That for a whole decade, there were articles and articles that started like that. And now, if we write about that, we should say, Italy was first a country of immigration, then it became a country of immigration. Then, again, after 2013, Istat has been telling us that the number of people who emigrate is higher than the number of people who immigrate. Mm-hmm. Now, numbers, we have to also question the way, we have these numbers, but as Teresa actually, Fiore wrote in her beautiful Preoccupied Spaces, the number, now it's a little, of course, the number is a little different. The data was from 2016, 2017, and now but the number of Italian people who live abroad and the number of people who actually enter Italy, the number of immigrants is more or less the same. So we also, and this is something that has been done. There is a lot of work. For example, a beautiful book by Maddalena, the Maddalena Tirabassi and Alvise del Pra about the impact of COVID on migrations in 2020, 2021, and how that has changed. So yeah, there are different number of trajectories towards different countries even now. And yeah, no, Brazil is actually one of the most interesting. Well, it's Brazil and Argentina are certainly countries that are crucial when we study Italian migrations.
Yeah. I was thinking that could be interesting because of Brazil's relationship with race as well.
Of
and
course.
The concept of whiteness, may be very different from what the concept of whiteness is in the United States. So it could be, the intersection with race could be a very different story when you examine.
Yeah, but also because while Italians were strongly racialized here, instead they were encouraged to go to Brazil because they were widening the population. So that is also something that
Absolutely.
is absolutely relevant for the racial history of Italians. Thank you, Aya. There was a question there, I think, yeah.
Thank you. First, thank you for such a wonderful work and necessary research. I'm Lebanese Italian, and I wondered if you stumbled sometimes on your research on, diasporas from Egypt, Syria, Libya, certainly, and how their stories sort of fit in this big narrative of the post-colonial Italianness. Did you ever research this side of the world, the eastern parts?
There are a number, I'm thinking about a couple of writers from Palestine, from North Africa, and of course the stories they tell, especially in what I identify as the first phase, so the beginning in the 90s, in the last decade of the past century. And I think that their voices, I'm thinking about a couple of authors specifically, I think that their voices add to the story of migration towards Italy. And I also want to maybe explain, I mean, for some people it's very clear that the term post-colonial, I think it's useful maybe to remind that the term post-colonial does not necessarily identify the relationship between a mother country and their colonies, but it's more a system, well, in terms of post-colonial literature, it's a literature that writes against that kind of against colonialism and coloniality as a system of power and a system of and the imaginaries that this transmits. So I also think that even writers that come from different parts of the world, but that they are part of this of coloniality as a system, a social system, a political system, an economic system, and so on. Can be part of this literary production.
Thank you.
Teresa.
The microphone is migrating. Hi, Caterina, and all of you, Eddie and Gabriella. Great to see you all. I am very interested in understanding how all of this translates into your classroom. We are a little bit more aware of how the curriculum has changed in the United States in Italian studies based on the influx of all these texts. But I don't know that much about Italy, actually. So are you able to teach your books directly, for example? And mostly I'm interested in how young people are responding to these issues, because they're also a very fluid generation.
Very
fluid generation, right? And it does not mean that, of course, differences are overcome by any means, but they just use a very different, young people use a very different set of perceptions and terms, right, to identify each other, to relate to others. So I'm just curious to understand how all of this gets inflected in Italy.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Teresa, for this question, which is a very interesting and necessary question, I think, because I think what you're saying, the curriculum has changed in the United States, and this is something that I actually write about in the introduction, precisely because I've seen things happening both here and in the United Kingdom that certainly show that there is a necessity, I think, a need to decolonize Italian studies and Italian culture. Now, in my experience, it's still very different for scholars professionally who write about this kind of thing, because Italy is a very, I think, my impression is that Italy is a very traditional culture, and it's difficult to incorporate something that is so far from the canon. Okay. On the other hand, in my perception, and I do have a very clear perception because I have this large class, students love to hear about this kind of things. They are really extremely interested, not only in the fact that my courses are always about not contemporaneity, meaning the 20th century, meaning the day before yesterday, right? We always read this kind of texts that were published, came out last year, for example. And they're very, and then I invite writers to class, and so that, they have a conversation with them. It's always very interesting, and they like to know, they like to meet this, get to know this, read this text, get to know this, and also all the problematics that are there, but they all are also very interested in the different methodology. This is something that generally they have a much more philological approach to literature, much less culturalist, and so what I have experienced is that once they discover a post-colonial perspective, a feminist perspective, what comes from cultural study, and that is something they have not seen much at the university. They always tell me that this opens their eyes in ways that a more traditional way of studying literature sometimes doesn't. So I think that this is something that is extremely appreciated by students.
How about high school?
High school.
Before they get to university, are they exposed to any of these texts?
I don't know. We could ask my daughter, who's here. I don't think they are, actually. One thing that I do ask in class, I have the big course. There are like 150 people. They're sophomores, so second year. And I ask them if they know about colonialism, if they have studied colonialism history. They barely know something about that, which tells you a lot about. And actually, this year my students were observing. I didn't even know that in Sapienza there is no course, no systematic course on colonial history, which sounds a little scary to me. I don't think they're exposed. I know that some of these authors, Ijabashego, for example, but also Rubka Shibato was doing a lot was visiting schools, and they've done a lot of work on that. So there are some schools where this is done, but it's not part of the curriculum. I don't know if not at all or very little. I would say maybe not at all.
And I think we're winding down here, but I just, talking about Jabashego, she's one of the finalists for the Premio Strega, which is the most prestigious literary prize in Italy at the moment. So she's one of the 12 finalists. How do you read this quite incredible event, I have to say? Because unlike England or France, Afro-descendant writers, so really are not really in the mainstream of Italian culture.
Yes, I think this is remarkable. She was, as you know, she was candidated by Giunta Lahiri, so that is, of course, something that is important in itself. We know her work, on postcolonial, transnational, translingual. So the fact that she was candidated by such an author is already significant, I think, in itself. And I also think that it's extremely relevant that she is in the 12 finalists. that the Giabashego is, because that is something that is beyond the national imaginary. One thing that I also want to say, however, is that there is always, when I see these kind of things, I always think about the notion of tokenism and of how this has, you know, the danger is that one danger is that once one author has reached that kind of position, we may tend to think that that is something that now, you know, black authors can do, and instead, you know, there is a lot of attention. We have to remember that Giabashego is probably the most well-known black writer in Italy. So, of course, there is a lot of other literature that is virtually unknown or very little known that needs attention. And that, you know, I think that that is something that is certainly very important. And there is a lot of work that we all have to continue doing, both here and here, elsewhere, and in Italy.
Caterina, I have the last question, and it's for all three of us. And you just mentioned Giunta, and it's a question that has to do with Giunta and Amara Lacus. There are two writers that are not Italian-born. They're not immigrated to Italy. They live in it. They lived in Italy deliberately as a choice at a certain part of their life, and. The interesting thing is that for Amara, he was speaking here on our stage, the choice of Italian was a deliberate choice, and it was an anti-colonial choice. He was Algerian, he spoke Berber at home, Arabic in school, and French would have been the natural segue for his career, especially literary career. And he deliberately, of course, refused to go that route and embraced Italian language because he fell in love with Italian comedy Italian style, the movies of the 60s and 70s. At least that's the narrative that he created for his adoption of Italian, to go away from the colonial language that was still hanging over Algeria, even if, of course, when Amara was going to school, Algeria was already independent. And for Giunta, it was, again, a free choice among all the languages in the world. She picked Italian. And I think also the function that writers like them, or Elena Janecek, who won the Strega Prize last year, also an immigrant, born of Jewish-Polish parents in Germany. Her first language is German. The first book she published was a collection of poems in German. I think these writers remind us that the tradition of Italian literature is a tradition of non-native speakers that write in Italian. If you exclude the founders of Italian literature, the three crowns, everybody after them who did not happen to be born in Florence was writing in Italian as an exercise in a foreign language. For Manzoni, Italian was a foreign language. He was fluent in the dialects of Milan. The language of culture was French. So Italian was something that he had to teach himself, he had to learn. And these writers, the paradox is that these writers, Ijaba, Amara, Giunta, Elena Janecek, remind us also of that. And that's a very important message that they're sending to Italy. It's a cultural message, and it's also a political message. The Italian literary language does not belong to people who are born in Italy, does not belong to people who have Italian blood. That seems the obsession of the current government. It belongs to anybody who bothers to learn it, to speak it, and to write it. So I think that's also a very important point to be made in terms of the relationship between language, literature, and politics. But I wanted to know what you...
I absolutely agree, and I absolutely think that it's very important to, you know, as social and socially and politically, to have a broader idea of what is Italian, what is Italianità. I remember years ago, many years ago, a colleague of mine involved in a course she was teaching, and I was teaching this semester, this course in Italian literature, where there was no author who would have been considered traditionally Italian. for example, I included Italian-American writers claiming that that was also Italian literature. So, because that is Italian literature, of course. It's not even written in Italian, but it's Italian literature. It's part of the Italian history, as well as what you're saying, you know, writers who, for different reasons, the anti-colonial choice, for example, I remember this book, come si chiama? Si chiama Volevo diventare bianca, I wanted to become white. Nasera Chora, exactly, who also is of Algerian, Sahrawi origins, and she doesn't write in French, she writes in Italian. So the reason why you write in Italian can be different reasons, but that is, of course, part of the cultures. And it's, as you were saying, a very important political and social move, because we need to go beyond the idea that Italian is only what is within the national boundaries, and it's you know, written by people who look like us, who have names similar to us. Many years ago, it was 2011, we wanted to visit an exhibition. I went with the whole class, like 100 people, to see this exhibition that, of course, was closed and it was not announced online. So we get there and there is no exhibition, in any case. And it was the year of the anniversario dell'unificazione, so 150th 150th anniversary of Italian unification, and the exhibition was right there. So I suggested, okay, let's go and visit this one. And I was completely astounded in seeing that in the history of Italian unification of this, you know, 150, there was no immigrant or emigrant. There was no history of migration in any direction. How can you possibly speak about you know, the history of the Italian nation without speaking about migrants? So, of course, or you know, people who come from another background and they write in Italian, or people who go elsewhere and write about the history of Italy in another language, and so on. So I think, yeah, I agree with you. This is socially and politically extremely important, especially even more so now.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very, very much.